When I moved into the apartment in New York, I thought I'd finally have peace. The building was old, with weathered bricks and windows that told stories of decades past. But something about the neighbor on the 13th floor always bothered me. He barely spoke, kept his eyes low, and seemed to carry an aura of darkness. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. New city, new life, new paranoia. But as the weeks passed, I started noticing something strange. Every time I passed his door, a strong, nauseating smell of sulfur hit me. It was suffocating. One night, as I climbed the stairs, I heard whispers coming from his apartment, like dozens of voices speaking all at once in a language I couldn't recognize. Things began to get worse inside my apartment. First, the lights started flickering without explanation. Then, objects began moving on their own. Pots and pans would crash to the floor in the middle of the night. Cabinets would swing open, and I'd hear footsteps in the hallway, even though I was alone. One night, I woke up to the sound of muffled laughter coming from the living room. My heart racing, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and went to check. The chairs were overturned, and on the floor were handprints made of a black, viscous substance. The next day, I decided to confront the neighbor. I knocked on his door and he appeared, pale-faced with hollow eyes. "You summoned something, didn't you?" I asked. He just laughed and replied in a hoarse voice, "It wasn't me who brought it, but you're already marked." That night, I always loved camping, the fresh air, the quiet of the forest, and the crackling of a campfire. It was my escape from the chaos of everyday life. So, when I found a remote spot deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, I thought I'd discovered the perfect getaway. The first day was uneventful. I pitched my tent, collected firewood, and spent the evening under a blanket of stars. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It felt peaceful, but that peace didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was something else. It sounded like a voice, a low, guttural whisper coming from somewhere outside my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, scanning the area. The forest was still, but the whispering continued, now seeming to come from all around me. The beam of my flashlight caught movement in the trees, a shadow darting between the trunks, too quick to see clearly. I called out, "Who's there?" The whispering stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling my campsite. I backed into my tent, heart pounding, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps stopped just outside, and for a moment, I thought whatever it was might leave. But then, the side of the tent caved in slightly, as if something was pressing against it from the outside. I didn't wait to find out what it was. Grabbing my bag, I bolted from the tent and ran into the woods. I didn't care which direction I was going. I just wanted to get away. But the whispering started again, closer this time, and no matter how far I ran, it seemed to follow me. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing and collapsed, gasping for breath. The forest around me was unnervingly quiet. No insects, no animals, just silence. I turned off my flashlight, trying to stay hidden, but as soon as the light was out, I felt it. Eyes, dozens of them, watching me from the shadows. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the tree line. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs too long and its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. It didn't have a face, just a blank, pale surface where one should have been. It tilted its head, as if studying me, and then took a step closer. I scrambled to my feet and ran again, this time heading toward where I thought the road might be. Branches scratched at my arms and face, but I didn't stop. The whispering grew louder, now echoing in my ears, a chorus of voices repeating my name. Just as I thought I couldn't run any farther, I saw headlights in the distance. I burst onto the dirt road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The driver, a kind-looking older man, rolled down his window and asked if I was okay. Before I could answer, I glanced back at the forest. The figure was standing at the edge of the trees watching, but it didn't follow me. I didn't go back for my tent or my gear. To this day, I don't know what I saw in those woods. But sometimes, at night, I still hear the whispers. They sound just like they did that night, calling my name. And you? Have you ever felt like you weren't alone in the wilderness? Share your story and stay tuned for the next tale, one that might keep you from venturing too far from home. When I moved into my new house, I barely noticed the basement. It was a typical storage space, dusty and dark, with a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. I didn't think much of it until the first night. Around midnight, I heard something strange, a faint scraping sound, like metal dragging across concrete. At first, I thought it might be the pipes or the old foundation settling. But as the nights passed, the noises grew louder and more deliberate. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the creaky stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the light from the single bulb barely illuminated the room. The basement was just as I remembered. Old furniture, a few boxes, and dust everywhere. But then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the far corner, the wall looked wrong. The bricks were slightly discolored, and the mortar seemed freshly disturbed. I moved closer, and that's when I felt it. The air around me grew heavy, and I could hear faint whispers, too soft to make out. My heart raced as I reached out to touch the wall. The second my fingers grazed the brick, the whispers stopped. Silence. Then, a loud thud echoed through the basement. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand. Behind me, one of the old boxes had toppled over, spilling its contents, a rusted shovel, and a single dirty shoe. Before I could make sense of it, the light bulb flickered and went out. I was plunged into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the stairs, but then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the same corner where the strange wall stood. My flashlight flickered back to life, and in its weak beam, I saw it. A shadowy figure, taller than any human, emerging from the wall. Its eyes were two glowing red orbs, fixed directly on me. It moved without sound, gliding closer as I stood frozen in fear. Somehow, I managed to break free from my paralysis and scrambled up the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. For the rest of the night, I sat in the living room, listening to the sounds of faint scratching and footsteps coming from below. The next morning, I called a contractor to inspect the basement. When they knocked down the strange wall, they found a small hidden room. Inside were piles of bones, some human, some not. The contractor left without saying a word, and I never stayed another night in that house. And you? Have you ever heard something unexplainable in the middle of the night? Let me know your story and stay tuned for the next tale. it might be even closer to home than you think. When I rented the old house on the outskirts of town, everything seemed perfect. It was spacious, with a charming garden and a price that felt too good to be true. The landlord was polite, but as he handed me the keys, he paused. He looked me straight in the eyes and simply said, "Never go into the last room at night." I found it odd, but shrugged it off. Probably just a silly superstition. During the day, the house was cozy, filled with light and the peaceful sounds of birds in the yard. But at night, it seemed to change. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The first week, I started hearing something in the hallway while trying to sleep. It was faint, like someone whispering just outside the door of the last room. I tried to ignore it, but the voices grew clearer with each passing night. By the third night, I gathered the courage to approach the room. The doorknob felt unnaturally cold. Pressing my ear against the door, I distinctly heard someone call my name, slow and deep. Curiosity overtook fear. I pushed the door open and switched on the light. The room was empty, but the air inside was different, heavier, as if something unseen was watching me. The walls were scratched with hand-drawn symbols, and a chair sat in the center of the room, turned toward me, as if someone had just gotten up. That night, the sounds changed, no longer whispers. I heard slow, dragging footsteps in the hallway. When I rushed to check, no one was there. On the sixth night, I woke up suddenly for no apparent reason. My bedroom was dark, but I could swear something was moving in the corner. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight. A pair of eyes gleamed in the darkness. They vanished in an instant, but it was enough to freeze me in place. The next day, I decided to leave the house, but as I loaded my belongings into the car, I noticed the door to the last room was slightly ajar. I could have sworn I locked it. One last look. Maybe I needed to face whatever was inside. I stepped in with my heart pounding and saw something that made me drop everything and run. On the floor were black handprints that hadn't been there before. In the dusty mirror, my reflection wasn't mine. It smiled and whispered, "It's too late now." The last thing I remember before blacking out was the door slamming shut on its own, with a force that shook the entire house. And you? Have you ever experienced anything like this? Share your story in the comments and get ready for the next tale. It's going to be even scarier. When I inherited the old family manor, I wasn't sure if it was a blessing or a curse. The house was massive, surrounded by overgrown trees, and looked as if it had been plucked straight out of a Gothic horror novel. My great-uncle, the previous owner, had been a recluse, and no one had entered the house in decades. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time exploring the house, brushing off layers of dust and discovering antique furniture that seemed frozen in time. But then, I found the door. It was hidden behind a tall bookcase in the library. The edge of the bookcase didn't quite sit flush with the wall, and when I pushed it aside, there it was. A small, ornate wooden door. It had no handle, only a strange symbol carved into its surface. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was likely a closet or an unused room, I told myself. But as the days passed, I became increasingly aware of its presence. The door seemed to hum softly, like a faint vibration you could only feel when standing close. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to open it. Using a crowbar, I pried the door open with a loud crack. The smell hit me first. an earthy, metallic scent, like damp soil mixed with rust. Shining my flashlight inside, I saw a narrow spiral staircase leading down into darkness. Curiosity overtook caution, and I descended. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls were damp and covered in strange, unfamiliar symbols. The staircase seemed impossibly long, as though I'd gone far deeper than the foundation of the house. Finally, I reached the bottom. The room was circular, with stone walls and a single pedestal in the center. On the pedestal sat an ancient-looking box, its surface covered in the same symbols as the walls. I hesitated, but something compelled me to open it. Inside was a mirror, small enough to fit in the palm of my hand. Its surface was black, like polished obsidian, and cold to the touch. As I held it, I heard something. A faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably real. It seemed to come from the mirror itself. When I looked into it, I didn't see my reflection. Instead, I saw a figure standing in the room behind me, tall and cloaked in shadow. I spun around, but there was no one there. That night, I had terrible dreams. I was trapped in the manor, running through endless corridors as something chased me. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of whispers still echoing in my ears. The mirror was on the bedside table, though I didn't remember bringing it upstairs. Over the next few days, things escalated. Doors slammed on their own, shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any, and I constantly felt like I was being watched. I tried to leave the house, but every time I stepped outside, I felt an overwhelming urge to go back in. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just sounds anymore. They were words calling my name, telling me to return to the room below. On the 7th night, I couldn't resist. I found myself walking down the spiral staircase, the mirror clutched in my hand. This time, the room wasn't empty. The shadowy figure from the mirror stood by the pedestal, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. It raised a hand and pointed at me, and suddenly I couldn't move. The whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices screaming inside my head. The last thing I remember was the figure stepping closer, its cold breath on my face, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my bed. The house was silent, eerily so, and the mirror was gone. But the door in the library was open again, and faint whispers echoed from the staircase below. And you? Have you ever felt drawn to something you couldn't explain? Let me know your thoughts in the comments and prepare yourself. The next story might pull you in even deeper. When I moved into the small old apartment, I thought it was a perfect fit. The rent was cheap and the place had character. Creaky wooden floors, tall windows, and plenty of charm. There was only one odd thing about it, a locked door at the end of the hallway. The landlord was vague when I asked about it. "Just storage," she said, avoiding eye contact. "Don't worry about it." I didn't push further at the time, but the door unnerved me. It felt like it didn't belong there. The wood darker than the rest of the house, the frame slightly crooked. For the first few days, I ignored it. But at night, I started hearing noises, soft knocks and faint scratching sounds coming from the other side. I told myself it was my imagination, but it happened every night, always, just as I was about to fall asleep. One night, the noises grew louder. I turned on the lights and stared down the hallway. The door seemed different, almost as if it was leaning toward me. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic thud. Unable to stand it anymore, I grabbed a screwdriver and tried to pry the door open. It wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I tried. Frustrated, I pressed my ear against it, hoping to hear something. What I heard made my blood run cold. A voice, low and distorted, whispered, "Let me out." I stumbled back, terrified. The knocking grew more frantic, the door trembling in its frame. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the apartment, spending the night in my car. The next day, I returned with a locksmith. When we opened the door, the room was empty. No furniture, no storage, just 4 blank walls and an icy draft that chilled me to the bone. On the floor, etched into the wood, was a single word: run. And you? Have you ever heard something strange behind a closed door? Let me know your story and get ready. The next tale might make you think twice about opening it.